So welcome everybody to our second public AWG meeting, Corda AWG. Got a good agenda for you today. I'll quickly run through that and then we'll get straight on with the meeting. Just to let people know, we wanted to try and get a webinar set up for this session, but weren't able to do that, unfortunately, with our supplier in time. So we're still running some GoToMeeting. So for those of you who had to call in, apologies for that, but we'll sort that for the next meeting. You can access all the meeting materials from corda.net/AWG. There is a little demo later in the agenda, and for those of you who've dialed in, if you dialed in, you won't see that demo, but we are recording the session and we'll publish that on the corda.net website, so you'll be able to see that later. So just to quickly run through the agenda, we'll start off with an introduction and news from R3 from Richard Gendel-Brown. That'll be 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll move into a discussion of the Corda M14 release. And we have Mike Hearn online to take you through what that comprises and take any immediate questions on that. Then we're excited to announce that we have Gary Rowe from HSBC talking to us and providing the demo, as I mentioned earlier, talking about the trade finance initiative, which we're calling Voltron X. So lots of good stuff being built out on Corda there, and Gary's going to take us through how that's doing. And then we're going to move to a Q&A panel. So we thought, given this is the second meeting for people who are new to the AWG and this conference call, we'd give you the opportunity to ask questions of the Corda team and the R3 team. So we're all lined up, ready and waiting for lots of questions. And you've got probably half of the agenda to come up with questions. So we're expecting lots of conversation there. I'm looking forward to that session. And then it's any other questions, any other business, and we'll close. If we finish early, we finish early, but we've outlined an hour for the session. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Richard. Sorry.
Thanks, Nigel. Hi, everybody. Richard Brown here. So first of all, welcome to all our new members. So we, as most of you know, at our last AWG 2 weeks ago, it was the first time we'd opened up this call to the broader Corda community, developers, partners, members of our Slack channel, anybody who's interested in, excited by, or building on top of Corda. And it's great to see so many of you dialed in and active in the community. So I wanted to give you a quick update on what's been going on in the last 2 weeks and what is coming up in the next few weeks. So the big news, which Mike Hearn will take us through, is the release of Corda Milestone M14, Corda Milestone 14, that came out earlier this week. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and it's either the last or the penultimate release. We'll decide when we see what quality we've hit before Corda 1.0 at the end of September. So we're getting very, very close to API stability now, targeted for September 30th. And then the other big piece of news I wanted to share is the members conference, CordaCon, that is happening on September the 12th. So this is a free conference in London, September the 12th, the first global Corda conference we've ever had, which is open to the entire community. You can go to corda.net/CordaCon, CORDACON, corda.net/CordaCon to see the agenda and register. So it's a full day, highly technically focused session that anybody interested in Corda is entitled to attend. Register at that website. Several new speakers will be announced in the coming days. There'll be a big focus on Corda. We have Marley Gray, the blockchain lead from Microsoft, will be presenting. There'll be a lot of information on Intel SGX and our proposed usage of it. And given that this is in London, where our engineering center is, most, if not all, of the R3 developers will be in attendance as well, many of them presenting on their components. So if you ever wanted to meet the team, or if there's any questions you wanted to get asked or just get closer to what we're doing, then please do come. It should be a very exciting day. So September the 12th in London, corda.net/CordaCon. But that's to come. The big news of the last few weeks was the M14 release. So I'll hand over now to Mike for an update on that and what he's got planned between now and September.
Right. Thanks, Richard. If anyone's got questions, just stick them in the chat or unmute and feel free to butt in. I won't mind at all. All right, so we've got a blog post on the Corda blog, which takes you through these release notes. I will be sending them to we'll be sending them to the AWG mailing list soon, for those of you who prefer to get the news via mail. There's a lot of stuff in M14, so most of the work we've been doing is about ensuring we can commit to a very long-term API stability, or making sure that we feel we can do that. We are being very ambitious with this. We are aiming for Java style, the sort of same level of commitment that the same level of commitment that the Java team give to their developers, we want to give to Corda app developers as well. So you should be able to write an app and still have it work 10 years later. This takes a lot of planning. I think we'll get it right. We've certainly got experience of doing this sort of thing before, but a lot of the work we're doing right now is maneuvering to ensure that we are in a position to do that. For example, we have been formalizing how Corda app jars, what code they contain, how they depend on each other, how they depend on the platform. We've been aligning things such that we can migrate to Java modules in Java 9 when we decide to go through that migration, which won't happen this year, but probably at some point next year, we'll see. Jigsaw modules that are shipping in Java 9 have a variety of rules around what you can and cannot do, how, for example, you can only export at the package level, not the class level. So we've been moving things around to ensure we're ready for that. There's a nice diagram on the blog post, which shows some how this sort of thing works and how we're using class loaders to implement an interim solution until we can upgrade to the more sophisticated Jigsaw system next year. Another thing we've been doing as part of that is making it clear which classes are part of our public API and which ones are internal. This has been a sort of ongoing process throughout the development of Corda, where we started with a sort of monolithic code base as we developed the core concepts. And now we've been moving code into packages that have internal in the name if they aren't something that developers are meant to use. This makes it very easy to see which classes are available. We're also going to be making sure that Java docs reflect that, and a lot of the code has been moved into separate modules as well, which you won't even depend on. So there isn't even any chance that things will appear in your IDE as developing if they're internal for most of this stuff. Finally, we used Google's popular Guava package during development. Those types is a great library, but it's not backwards compatible over the long run. They don't guarantee that. So we've been going through and identifying cases where those things from Guava slipped into our public API, and we've been removing them or replacing them with our own equivalents. Again, this is so that we can provide this like ultra long-term API stability that we think people are going to really love. Okay, it's not all about that. We haven't just been rearranging things and moving things around. We've also added features to the Vault query service. We now have support for aggregate functions like sum, min, max, average, and count, with grouping by clauses and sorting. As a reminder, the Vault query service is a type-safe, Corda-specific query API that understands the core types like party and amount and so on. It's also database neutral, of course. Corda has supported now for a long time the notion that you can just directly connect to a database and run SQL yourself. So we're providing a subset of what SQL provides. That's not limiting to you. It means that if you want to go outside what the Vault query service provides, then you'll need to know the database you're working with and know how to use a SQL dialect, but we're not blocking anything off from you. And in fact, we've added an API in M14 to allow flows to obtain a JDBC connection. So this has always been possible, but it wasn't always well documented how to do this. This is now formally a part of the API. And this is going to help developers a lot, in particular when working with your own data sets that don't really need to be on the ledger at all. We've also been doing some work on separating financial concepts from the Corda core. So Corda today is essentially, it's come out of the finance world. It's essentially focused on finance, but there's no technical reason why it must be so. And there are many interesting, exciting use cases for blockchain technology in other areas of the economy, like supply chain tracking, healthcare. I was talking to some guy, to a local entrepreneur in Zurich, actually, just a week or two ago, and he told me about some projects in the health industry where they're looking at Corda as well. So we are separating out finance and putting that into a separate module, so it is a separate part of the API, clearly demarcated. And finance will probably be stabilized soon after 1.0 release, but in the 1.0 release, we're aiming to stabilize the core with financial apps and types separate, following soon after. Right? So it should be M14 should be a pretty easy upgrade. In fact, most stuff is not. There are no big conceptual changes or anything like that. It's mostly just changing your import lines, and most stuff will continue to work. So what's coming, right? That's M14. So what's coming? One of the projects we're working on at the moment is something I've mentioned before, which is some big upgrades to the network map infrastructure. The current network map is just a server that every node connects to. It doesn't scale very well. It's hard to defend and so on. We're reworking this to enable network maps information to be put on high availability CDNs like Akamai, Limelight, Cloudflare, and things like that. We're working on making it more reliable, more extensible. We're also considering, we've also been lately considering use cases where companies, financial services companies, wish to onboard an existing large customer base into Corda by issuing identities on their behalf, running nodes on their behalf, and so on, in a way that allows those customers to take over their Corda identity and activity later on. You know, this is historically something that we haven't thought about a whole lot. The assumption was that companies would, you know, install Corda and go through a ID verification, and then they would interact with their peers. But what we're seeing is a lot of demand to do sort of staged rollouts where, especially for very small organizations or smaller companies that don't really have their own IT departments or not that tech savvy, where another company can do it on their behalf. And this, as part of that, we're looking at very, very small tweaks to the network map design that we're implementing to allow one of the concerns that comes up with this is confidentiality of customer lists. And, you know, maybe if we're very successful, you know, 10 years from now, so many companies will be a part of a shared Corda compatibility zone that this won't be an issue anymore. But in the beginning, sometimes people want to keep their list of, you know, they want to separate the network map out so not everyone can be aware of everyone else on the network. We're looking at ways to support that as a transition mechanism in the early days at the moment. Finally, confidential identities, the feature which anonymizes transactions and de-anonymizes them automatically, depending on context, is in its final phases. We have a PR open that's gone for extensive review to begin integrating that. And we're just working on making the API even simpler and more automatic than it already is. Confidential identities is sort of like taking the concept from Bitcoin where keys are rotated constantly. So you take a look at a transaction and you see random public keys, you don't know who owns them, but with a lot of infrastructure on top to automatically map that back to legitimate verified identities on the fly. So developers don't have to think about this. And this is great because as you may have seen a few days ago, we published a research paper, Blockchain and Law. It's a good paper. I recommend we read it, even for us developers. You know, we all have to understand the law. And it talks about how blockchain technology interacts with like data protection law and so on. And it turns out that very often, you know, the rules around exporting personally identifiable data are different if the data is anonymized. Of course, Corda already limits the data propagation, and we have things like SGX to encrypt it. So this is only one more layer, right? This is defense in depth. Rather than depend entirely on any one technique, we are building multiple privacy techniques in, but this one is something that should be very easily understood by regulators around the world. And that's M14. That's some of the stuff we're working on. And I will hand back to you, Nigel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold questions because we have the Q&A panel later. So I'm sure you may well have questions to Mike on M14 under aspects of Corda, but we can cover those in the Q&A panel. So I'm now going to ask Gary to step up to the plate. If you're online, Gary, and talk about Voltron.
Hi, thank you, Nigel. Okay. Yes, if you could make me presenter, that would be handy.
Bear with me 1 second.
Okay. So can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, see it okay, yeah.
Okay, right, so put that down now. Okay then. So this is all about the wrap-up of Voltron, which was a project that was completed in accordance with R3 as a collaboration between several banks back in June, and you know, this is the cut-down version of the wrap-up presentation. So Voltron is an R3 project that's looking at letters of credit, and from the architecture working group point of view, it incorporates several interesting code techniques, which I'm going to talk about. All the code that was done is available to all the Voltron members, and most likely will also be available to Voltron X members, which I'll talk about later on. Overall, I'd like to say that it represents a successful collaboration between several banks, and we were very pleased with the outcome. So for those of you not familiar with letters of credit and trade finance, I'll just briefly introduce the different characters that are involved in it. Essentially, letters of credit are used in order to be able to facilitate financing of a purchase across international boundaries normally. So you have an applicant, who's the buyer, the borrower, an issuing bank, they're the buyer's bank. The beneficiary is the one who's doing the selling, the exporter. The advising bank, that's the seller's bank. And then finally, you have the carrier, shipping company like Maersk or something like that. So as part of the overall project, what we found was very rapidly was that communication channels like email and that kind of stuff just weren't going to work. So we very quickly switched to using GoToMeeting like we're using now, and also for Slack for instantaneous communication, phone calls, that kind of thing. It worked very, very well. We implemented a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline, which I'll go into in a minute, via a company called GitLab.com, which is different to GitHub. And we also used technology called Docker Swarm. The project demonstrates interoperability between R3's Corda and Fabric. It's a very small amount. I won't go into it in this presentation, but if people are particularly interested in that, I can go into some more detail offline. And it also demonstrates the full lifecycle support for letters of credit use cases. So what is CI/CD? What is continuous integration, continuous delivery? The continuous integration part of it, most people are familiar with. It represents the power to be able to very quickly get teams of developers to be able to synchronize their code, to be able to build separately, but then have everything come together and to fail fast in the event of something going wrong. Continuous delivery then takes it to the next level where you're continuously pushing out to a deployment platform, most likely the dev platform, but it can be fully automated right the way through test and up into production. The general rule of continuous delivery is that you treat your server like cattle, not pets. So if you treat your server like pets, then you're making continuous, very careful updates to them. Yeah, so like each individual server is carefully looked after. In the case of cattle, it's a case of, well, that one isn't working. Just put it to one side for forensic analysis. Why it failed. Spin up another one quick and keep the service up and running. Another part of CI/CD is that it allows you to be automated from commit right the way through to deploy. So essentially, a developer will just do a merge into the develop branch, and that kicks off the overall build process. And 5 minutes later, they can see their changes on their website. And this is all made possible through a technology called Docker Swarm, which is an orchestration process which allows multiple Docker containers to be synchronized and interoperate correctly. So I'll just talk you through the overall process of how this works. So a developer will commit some code and then pushes that upstream, the usual Git process. GitLab are able to detect the change and then trigger a clean build, so they'll spin up their own virtual machine. They use Docker behind the scenes, and then so that will actually make the clean build occur. The build succeeds, and GitLab will store that Docker container and in their registry, so that's available. And this is all done privately, so that nobody else can see these containers. Okay, GitLab will then instruct Docker Swarm to on AWS or Azure or whichever cloud provider you want, to perform the update. Docker Swarm will then pull the new Docker containers from GitLab, and then finally, Docker Swarm will replace the old containers with the new ones gracefully. So it'll drain out the old ones and just spin up the new ones as required. All automatic. Developer doesn't have to do anything. It's all done from a single commit. So the general structure of a Corda project consists of a Corda app, which is a jar, which essentially contains the business logic. These are the Corda flows and the contracts and everything associated with that. This jar is then added to a Corda node, and that overall structure is then wrapped in a Docker container. The Voltron service is the next layer down, which provides a REST or a WebSocket interface into the Corda node, and that is again wrapped with Docker. And finally, you have a Voltron application, which is the user interface, which is then delivered to the browser. That's also wrapped up in Docker. So let me just lay this out for you. So we have the top level, so it's basically going to consist of 3 levels. The vertical lines represent firewalls between businesses, essentially, or firewalls between nodes. So you could run a node in your private cloud, and then somebody else would run it in a different node. So we have, in this case, in the case of letters of credit, we have the applicant. Let's say they're a very large organization, they're running their own Corda node, and they would have the Voltron Corda app. Then they would be talking to their issuing bank, right, or their node would talk to the issuing bank node, okay, which would also be running Voltron. The issuing bank would then be able to talk to the advising bank, and the advising bank talk to the beneficiary through that horizontal chain, which is all done over firewalls and HTTPS. The Voltron service allows you to be able to interact vertically within these. So the horizontal lines essentially represent separations of concerns. So you have the Corda node is separate to a microservice, which is actually handling the REST API if you wanted to have WebSockets, that sort of thing. That's where we decided that we would be placing that. And then finally, you have the Voltron app itself, providing a user interface, which is delivered through a browser. And as you can see, there's a bunch of different browsers you can use. In addition to that, although this is slightly off topic for where we want to be for this presentation, we also introduced Hyperledger's Fabric, which allowed us to be able to demonstrate interoperability and between Corda and Fabric, so that we were able to make a transaction which started on Fabric, went across into Corda, and then came back out again and updated Fabric again, all within the dynamic of a flow. So the general structure for that was that the Voltron chain code would be able to talk to the Voltron service REST API, which then talked to the Corda node. So it wasn't like a Fabric node talking directly to a Corda node. It went through an API. So as I mentioned, Corda flows are all encrypted and firewalled. So everything is in a private cloud. Because of Docker Swarm, everything is easy to scale both horizontally and vertically. So horizontal scaling, as you know, is basically having multiple instances of individual nodes or services backed behind a small proxy load balancer type effect, and vertically allowing just more memory and more hard drive and everything else. Docker Swarm just allows all of this stuff to be automatically provisioned. And so the overall, thanks to the choices that the R3 people have made, it's very easy to secure and to back up. There's no surprising technologies that were being used. It was all absolutely vanilla. So I want to talk a little bit about GitLab, right? Because we found that that was a very good way of being able to work overall. GitLab for free, right? Provide Git and Docker repositories, the full CI/CD pipeline support, issue tracking and reporting. It's all open source with enterprise support. So if you wanted to take the whole of the GitLab source code and run it on a private bank internal cloud for own developers and actually essentially own the code yourself, that's all supported. And they have external support contracts that you can have as well. So it's a fantastic piece of engineering on their behalf. And so far, we haven't found any fault with it. Special shout out to Mark Simpson from RBS for suggesting that, because it really accelerated our progress. In addition, the GitLab people are just currently working on putting private Maven repositories, which are under development and are scheduled apparently by December this year. So that's good news as well, because that solves another big problem of sharing artifacts around. So the role of Docker Swarm, I'll just quickly go over that, is you essentially have different types of machines, which are essentially managers and workers, which you put into a private cloud. Docker Swarm manages the containers and the network, so you can have all of your Corda nodes can be run up in an environment where they can't see anything else other than the services, which can't see anything else other than the applications. It means that all of these multiple internal networks are all. Oh, excuse me a second. Oh dear, I need to have a drink of water. all these multiple internal networks are all automatically configured through a very simple YAML file, which you can provide to Docker Swarm, which you will then spin up your configuration as you need. And we found that AWS worked for us on this one, but it's just as easy to be able to deploy it to Azure or any of the other cloud providers. It provides you with dynamic proxying, service discovery, all of that sort of thing just takes place automatically. And it can be joined to the R3 testnet if you wanted to, because it's literally just running over queues through a HTTPS connection. So all of the stuff that I've been talking about is available as Voltron deliverable. So it's under R3's IP, so they can distribute that as they need to. We need a bit more work to have it as a general solution, which is where Voltron X comes in. And there's also thoughts at the time of having Corda to Ethereum interop, right, which could be quite interesting, and would use the same general approach. So normally I would stop here to ask for questions, but Nigel, would you like me to go on to do the demonstration of the user interface for Voltron X?
Yes, if you would, Gary, just to remind folks on the phone that we'll be recording the session, so if you can't see the demo that's about to come up, I believe it's about 5 minutes, is that right, Gary?
Yeah, very quickly. I'll shoot through it.
Then you will be able to see that again on the recording subsequently, which we'll put up on the website. So, and then we'll take questions after that.
And it's Richard here, and if you've just dialed in recently, if you are in front of a computer, go to corda.net/awg, and there's a link to the GoToMeeting, so you can actually see the video with one click, corda.net/awg.
Okay, then. So I'll just continue now.
Yeah. Yes, Gary, and maybe we can take just a question or so, then that'll give some time for people who can actually sign onto the computers to do so. So I don't know if there's any questions on the floor to Gary on what you've just heard about Voltron. And if you're struggling to come off mute, it's *6 on your phone, or you can type questions into the chat and we'll pick those up. Okay, Gary, I think you can probably kick off.
Right, so, no problem.
I'll let you know if something comes in on chat.
Okay, thank you. All right, so, okay then, so I'll give you a quick live demo of what we've got here. So, this is very much a work in progress. So, don't want you to think that this is like production quality code. It's just there to demonstrate that capability more than anything. So, what we have is, if you recall the overall architecture diagram, you had an applicant and you also had an issuing bank. So the use case I'm going to talk through is how you could go about doing this, sort of for real. So in this case here, we can sign in, and you'll notice here we've got a green button here which says sign in with Trezor. We decided that we would try and introduce a hardware security module. It's a very basic one. It's essentially like a Bitcoin wallet. It looks like this. And I've got one here in front of me. So I will attempt to log in with one of these. If anybody else wants to fiddle around with this, you can go to www.voltronx.site. And then that will take you into a demo area. Just click the demo button and then just use the tabs that are in there, and you can kind of follow along. But I'll sign in with Trezor here. So follow instructions on your device. So I click a little confirm button. Now I have to enter in a PIN number. So I shall just do that now. Here we are. Okay. And then, I'm logged in. So do the same on this side here. So this side here, I'm logging into, although I'm on the same site, I'm actually under a proxy here. So I'm actually acting as the buyer bank or the issuer. So I will log in as somebody separately here, who I will call Isabel. And the password is Isabel. All right, and that brings you into as an issuing bank. So in this case here, I'll just quickly create a new application. Okay, I've got a little autocomplete button here, so I'll just press that. And then, okay, now you notice very, very briefly, right, that this one here pushed, and it showed you this one here, a fraction before this one here. So what happened there was that we were able to do a quick application for essentially a letter of credit, and I won't go into all the details of that. But what I wanted to demonstrate here was in Voltron X, we are using a WebSocket interface, which is being provided through a combination of the front end, which is the Meteor framework, which I would recommend so anybody here to take a look at, which provides a reactive front end to the to your applications. So that means that as you make changes in one area, they are automatically pushed out to another one, which gives a much better user interface and keeps people up to date with what's going on. So what this has demonstrated is the ability to be able to start on one side of the stack of the browser, go all the way up through the applicant's Corda node, go through a flow to the issuing bank's Corda node, and then from the issuing bank to then push out to the microservice, which then pushes out to the Meteor server, which then pushes out to the bank, to the browser on the right-hand side there, and that all happened almost instantaneously. So we've still got a long way to go. This isn't the final version of the user interface. We're just still working our way through it. But I'd just like to say that this represents a lot of effort, right, that behind the scenes, and we're very pleased with the results so far. So I'll just hand back now to Nigel. I think that this concludes the presentation, but if anyone does have any questions, feel free.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Gary. That was really informative, very helpful. Let me open it up again to the floor for questions for Gary. A note there from Clemens saying thank you, but any questions from the floor on what you've seen regarding Voltron, either the demo or the presentation?
So it's Richard here. I'll kick it off while other people come off mute or write into the chat. So while you're doing that, I just went to voltronx.site, and yeah, you're right. Well, I guess of course you're right. You wrote it. It's all there. Is there any documentation we can point anyone at? Because I don't remember the password you used, so it takes me straight to a password screen. Is there anywhere, or can you stick it on the on Corda.net or something so people can figure out how to use it?
Okay, I mean, like I say, this site is not official. Okay, it's just something that we've knocked out, but it does allow you to be able to just kind of see where we're at with the Voltron X project. So I'll write the passwords here for people to be able to use them, but bear in mind that these are subject to change at a moment's notice, and we may take down the entire site. So don't rely on this for any of your own demonstrations or anything like that. Okay, but the passwords that you would use would be Alice for an applicant, okay, and you would use Isabel and Isabel, okay, for an issuing bank or an issuer. Okay, so I've just put that into the chat there, okay, and it's so spelled with double L with an E. So people can log in. I mean, like I say, it's very much demonstration code, okay, but so it's not production quality, but it's good enough to be able to serve as an example.
And there's a question in chat there from Julian Wood, Gary, about network and crossing firewalls. And so I'm not sure it's a question you can answer. It may require a more detailed answer, but is there anything you particularly say about how you cross the firewalls and firewall rules to connect the nodes?
Because we had full control over the clouds that we were using, it was relatively straightforward. We just actually just put in the host name with the HTTPS, and that was it. We just registered a few certificates, and that was it. It was just enough to be able to allow them to be accepted by the Java virtual machine. No, it was very straightforward.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions? I don't know if you're staying on the line, Gary, but maybe something will come up in the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. I'll be here for the whole meeting. So yeah, no problem.
Great. Well, thanks again. That's fantastic, and hopefully you will be able to play with that themselves. I think go onto that website you mentioned. We're now going to move to. Oh, somebody got a question?
Oh no, that was just me, just signing off. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So now we're going to move to the Q&A session. We've got just over 20 minutes left. This is your opportunity to ask any question within reason, of course. From the R3 team here. So just to remind you who's on, we've got Richard, who's our CTO, Mike, who's lead platform engineer for Corda. I think James is in New York and maybe it's not on the line, but we've got plenty of people to cover. James, Mike Ward will be online. He's our head of product management and marketing, although he does suffer from intermittent Wi-Fi problems from Australia. So I saw he dropped off just recently, but I think sure he'll dial back in quickly. Myself, who's head of delivery strategy and focusing on the rollout of the R3net, which builds on Corda to deliver network services out to users of Corda. And then Gavin, who's our CTO and deeply involved in management of Corda. So, sorry, technology CIO. I'm promoting Gavin. He's looking very pleased.
Not as pleased as me. I thought I could go on holiday. Yes. And we also, they don't know this, but we also have the brains behind the Corda Vault, our head of testing and our head of architecture in the room. So they think they're going to get away with it, but we're actually, we can roll them in as well.
Yeah, so to put names to faces, that's Matt Ritzo and Mark Oldfield, who are also online. So we're here to answer any question you have, and I'm sure there's plenty, and there may be questions that arose from Mike's walkthrough on M14 just now. But let's throw it open to the floor and see what we have. Who wants to go first? And don't be shy.
Always terrible. It's always terrible someone asking the first question, so I'll have a go. It's Barry from HSBC. Hey, first of all, thanks everyone for that briefing. That was excellent. My question is about primarily skill development around Corda. As this is rolling out, what we're seeing more and more is we're struggling with technical people who can actually build the stuff that we need more and more. So in other words, if you look at all the projects that are being done, they're very varied, and they're, quite honestly, there's an awful lot of them. Do you think, like, obviously we've put, initial basic training and things in place, but how do we create a larger group of Corda developers that can actually develop real-world solutions? Do you feel we've got what we need in place, or is there more we need to do? Maybe online courses or other things. I'd be interested in, particularly in Mike and Richard's view and James's view on, how can we create a larger group of developers that can do real-world work? Yeah.
Do you want to go first with that, Richard? Or
yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll go first and then hand over to you, Mike. So thanks, Barry. It's something we think about a lot. So as you were asking that question, I jotted down a few thoughts. So as you say, one of the first things our developer relations team was tasked with when they were formed at the start of this year was to build and roll out Corda training. So we've delivered that, I forget how many times now, maybe 10, 20 times around the world. In fact, Roger, our head of developer relations, is in Brazil delivering training to a full classroom as we speak. But as you say, that is not an entirely scalable model. So we're doing two things with that. One, in addition to continuing to run that training, which is free for a certain number of people, for members, and pretty competitively priced for everybody else. We also are building up a set of partners who can deliver it. Our first one was signed in Japan a couple of weeks ago and will be announced soon for in-person. In addition, we're currently in the process of turning the in-person training into online training. I know a lot of people find it much easier to do self-paced courses, and clearly that scales far more effectively. So that's a current priority for the team. In addition to that, there are two other things we're doing. One is in response to feedback, which in hindsight was obvious, but we've given it increased focus in recent months. Is although the core platform is written in Kotlin, as we've always said, there is no obligation or requirement for developers of Corda apps to write in Kotlin. Java is a first-class language, and that's what we expect most people to use, given that there are north of 7 million, if not 10 million Java developers in the world. So we're going through, this is an ongoing process, but we're going through a process of making sure all our samples, all our documentation, all our code examples, at the very least have a Java version, and ideally have Java first, so that people who know Java can get going on this without having to sort of think backwards and forwards into Kotlin, which we think will have a big impact. And then the final thing, and then I'll hand over to James, is the partner community. As we've said for a long time now, R3 does not intend or desire to be the firm that builds all the applications on top. We want our members, our community, and then partners such as software vendors and systems integrators and consultants to do that. So we spend a lot of time training them one-on-one, the partners and systems integrators, and encouraging them and enabling them, including, and this is my final point, inviting them to come and sit with our developers. So right now downstairs, we've got a collection of developers from one of our consulting partners who are working on a project, but sitting next to our developers. And that offer is open to anybody working on a meaningful project. If your team is in or near London and you think you get benefit from sitting alongside our guys, our team, let us know. We're a friendly bunch, and we'd love to have you with us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. Richard, sorry, Mike, I'll just add a caveat to that. Just to think,
sure.
Like, we've got the basic training, which is like you're new to Corda and you're going to do that boot camp, and that that's excellent. Yeah, everybody, the feedback I've had from my teams has been first class. But I wonder, should there be some like next level stuff being created as well? Could I add that into the discussion as well?
Yeah, sure. Over to you, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything Richard said is correct. I also want to echo a comment from Jeff on the chat. We've actually trained over 400 people across our membership. There are a couple of other things. Well, there are actually going to be a few other things we're doing to make developing Corda apps easier, right? One is the API stability, obviously. Right? One problem at the moment we have is that samples and people's knowledge keeps getting altered because we're just finalizing that design. Once we've done that, it'll be much easier for people to move beyond the proof of concept stage and start building much, much larger apps. We're also simplifying the API in some cases. When we first started doing Corda, when I first started writing it, it was very unclear what the use cases were going to be or how generic the code needed to be. So the sort of default was to make everything like very customizable and very generic. And as we've got experience over the last 18 months or so in the lab and watching people develop and not just Corda projects, but other projects too, we've found that we've gone back and we're reviewing stuff and we say, you don't actually, we could just provide a built-in solution for that. You don't actually need this to be pluggable and things like that. So we're able to simplify things that way. Finally, the tutorials and training we've got is good as far as it goes. One area in which it's relatively weak is frameworks for like recommendations and samples and frameworks for connecting web UIs to Corda nodes. Right? This is partly because there's a million different web frameworks in the world and different ways of doing basic things, and everyone has their own preferences. So our own UIs tend to be just JavaFX because we're already working on the JVM and there's sort of minimal effort to integrate. But having more samples for doing the things that, for example, Gary showed where he's sort of, everything is fully reactive and data is being pushed down to the web client when things change. You can't learn how to do that from the Corda documentation today. There's no reason for that. It's just we haven't got around to doing it. And as the core finally stabilizes and we leave it alone, we're going to be moving up the stack to show how to write more complex apps and filling out the gaps like that. So I think that's going to help a lot. And yeah, what Richard said about making sure every single code sample we have has a Java version as well as a Kotlin version.
Thanks, Mike.
We have a question come through on chat from Sean Zhang. So how soon can we have M14 support in testnet? So I think Gavin's probably a question for you.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thanks, Matthew. Typically you can expect to see testnet upgraded to the latest release 2 weeks after the release date. So in the case of M14, that takes us to August 23rd. If you've got access to the R3 wiki and you do a search for Corda testnet release schedule, you'll be able to see the latest date, and I'll put a link to that page in the GoToMeeting chat right now.
Thanks, Gavin.
Actually, just an additional point to that, because we mentioned this on the last call. So those of you who are not R3 members and were not on the call 2 weeks ago, you might be wondering what testnet is. Testnet is a long-running network of Corda nodes we run that currently any L3 member can connect to, and we have versions for M10, M12, and soon to be M14. We plan to make a testnet available to the broader community very soon. That'll be driven by demand. So those of you who think that could be useful to have access to other people who are working on Corda to be able to test your applications and connect to the oracles we're hosting and so forth, get in touch. most easily through our Slack channel will be driven by demand. So let us know when or if you need that, and we'll get on the case.
Okay, another question in the chat from Marcel. So how about having some blueprints and design patterns like Java EE? Mike, and probably one best for you to pick up.
Sorry, you dropped out something. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. How about having some blueprints and design patterns like Java EE?
Ah, yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, exactly. I'm fully in agreement with that. We've been, before we can publish such things, we need to develop them ourselves. And, we're writing more and more apps as part of various RFPs and things, and the complexity of those apps is going up. So the basic concepts and ideas that would go into such blueprints and design patterns are evolving now. We do have sample apps, right? That's sort of as far as we've got with that. And those are more like suggestions for how to lay things out and do things. One constant source of tension, right, is we want Corda to be very easy to get going with. Some consistent feedback we get is, it's easier to get started with Ethereum. It's sort of simpler to write apps for that. That's partly because, Ethereum and Fabric don't actually have the same feature set. And also because, their models are, they hit barriers later, right? So they sort of start out by having no privacy, and then you're expected to add channels and things that don't work that well, we think. Whereas Corda sort of hits you with more stuff up front. But then once you get a grip of it, it's smoother sailing from that point on, and you've got all the features you need. So we have this tension where we write samples and design patterns and guides. Do we target them for sophisticated large apps that are heading towards production, or people who are just getting started? We need to get better at providing both types, to be honest.
And to add to that, and I guess this is an example of the value of having people who are working on Corda sort of swing by our office from time to time. A group of developers who are working on an application were in our office last week and presented to us at our weekly tech talk on Friday. And they made a very similar point, which is was well made, and we're going to act on them when we get a chance. Which is, even in our current samples, it's not clear which of them are there to show how a particular feature works, and which of them are intended to show how to build a well-structured application. So we intend to give a bit more guidance on that. Just on the Java Enterprise Edition, though, that specific technology I have long and painful history and memory of, and I almost see it as my mission to make sure we never ever create a monstrosity like Java Enterprise Edition. My view of that, perhaps unfair, was that was an example of premature patterns and premature standardization. A lot of that stack was locked down before people actually knew what they'd be using Enterprise Java for and what the right patterns were. And I'm convinced and insistent that we don't make the same mistake in DLT, and certainly not with Corda. So we will be paying close attention to what people use it for, what works, where the natural way to use it is, and then we'll try and put standardization and patterns around that, but not try and top-down preordain the right answer, because they tried that with Java EE and it was a disaster.
Thanks, Richard. A couple more questions about training in the chat window around when we're going to have the first online training, which platform we're going to use. Those ones are a little more specific. Richard may be able to comment on that, but I think what we can do is put you in touch with our training guys, and they can give you a bit more detail, and potentially next time round we could get them to actually do a short slot on training, because it seems to be a hot topic. Richard, I don't know whether you have any update on those.
Yeah, so if Mike Ward would have been able to give us the answer, but he's actually ill. So dates, I don't know. We'll get them to you as soon as we can. Platform, we currently use an internal platform for our internal training called Lessonly. If we can find a way to open that up to the world, we will. Otherwise, it will be on a more standard platform. And as Clemens has said in the chat, there actually is already a lot of video content on our Vimeo channel, which Clemens has linked to. So a lot of our in-person training has been re-recorded as a set of videos. So if you've not seen that, do head over to the R3 Vimeo channel. There's, you may be surprised by how much content there is. I think there's about 3 hours of introductory concepts. So it doesn't go as deep as Barry would want, but if you've not been able to get to in-person training, there's the next best thing already there on Vimeo.
Okay, are there any more questions? Either unmute yourself and ask a question, or feel free to put it in the chat window.
As a reminder again, it's *6 to unmute on your phone if you're on the phone. Okay, well, I think I'll do the auctioneer thing and say go, see if there's any more questions. Just the comment there from Adam is a thank you, Adam, for the comments. And as Matt just alluded to, there's quite a lot of interest in training, so I think we may well focus on that in the next session. But thank you for everybody who's come along today. I hope you found that enjoyable and informative, and I hope you can join us for the next 2 weeks. Thank you to all the presenters, and particularly to Gary for his presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Got the question out from Mark.